Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for coming to this afternoon event on the Latin America's place in the world. Obviously, the last decade has been a very challenging times for the world and for Latin America, and geopolitically, the current trends in that has driven the world towards a more fragmented world. It has challenged Latin America both economically and politically. Obviously, the new government in the US also has significant changes planned for the way the US is going to interact with other countries in the world, and this is posing important challenges for Latin American countries. Obviously, the dynamics between China and the US is another area in which Latin American countries have been thinking and designing their diplomacy and their economic strategies. And all of that, it's a little bit the context with which or within which we want to hold today's discussion. I think it's a very timely occasion to hold this discussion here at Georgetown, and I think we could not have thought of a better panel to think through these issues. No, we have from now in Mexico, Mary Beth Sheridan. Mary Beth is a correspondent covering Mexico and Central America for the Washington Post. She came to the Post in 2001 after 11 years as a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, Miami Herald, and Los Angeles Times. During her career, she has been based in Rome, Bogota, Colombia, and Mexico City. Her previous assignments for the Post include covering diplomacy, homeland security, and immigration, and she served as deputy foreign editor from 2016 to 2018. Again, Mary Beth, thanks for being with us again here at Georgetown. Then we'll have Michael Shifter, who's an adjunct professor at the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University and former president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Michael held senior positions at the Dialogue for nearly 3 decades and served 12 years as president. He currently serves as senior fellow at that organization. Before that, Michael directed the Latin American and Caribbean program at the National Endowment for Democracy, and before that, the Ford Foundation Governance and Human Rights programs in the Andean region and Southern Cone. He holds a BA from Oberlin College and a master's in sociology from Harvard University. Finally, Camila Zuliaga will be with us. She's a journalist. She has an MA in public policy from Columbia University, a BA in political science from Universidad de los Andes. She's a director of Mañanas Blue, 10 a.m. on Blue Radio. She presents and directs the section Código Caracol in Noticias Caracol. She's a co-founder of Deep Detox, an innovation center and behavioral science consultant. So, as I said, I think we'll have a very interesting discussion. We will have each speaker talking for 10 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion among us, and then we will open it up for a Q&A session. So we will start with you, Michael, maybe helping us understand these few weeks of U.S. foreign policy and maybe how Latin Americans are reacting to that. We were in a conference the other day, and you had a great 7-point summary on what does this mean and what to expect. So let's start with that. Then we'll go to Camila, and then to Mary Beth, and then I'll close with some thoughts on the what does this all mean for the economies of the region.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Alejandro. It's a great pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and thanks to everybody for coming. And it's great to see my good friend Mary Beth and Camila on the screen. I was hoping I would see them in person, but hope that will happen soon. Since I assume that both of them will talk about Colombia and Mexico, maybe I will try to leave that to them. You're right. We just had this conference a few days ago, but it seems like 10 years ago compared to all the things that have happened in the last few days. But let me give you my sense, just the overall picture, at least the way I see things, where they're moving. There's no question that President Trump is moving ahead at a frenetic pace on both domestic and international affairs. He is clearly in charge, driven by his whims and impulses, which means that he's highly unpredictable. There's been a lot of chaos and confusion, which I think is unlikely to diminish over time. It's not surprising that Latin America has figured so prominently in the early decisions of the administration. Curbing migration and drugs to the U.S. and China's influence in the region are top priorities for this administration. They were actually also top priorities for the previous administration. But the approach is radically different. Trump has aimed his aggressive rhetoric and threats of sanctions, stopping visas, at Mexico, Canada, Panama, Colombia, in order to get his way on immigration, deportations, fentanyl, and Chinese influence. Diplomacy and multilateral consultations have really very little place in this scheme. What's the scorecard so far? Well, there have been competing spins from the White House and from Latin American governments, each claiming victory. Trump did get some concessions in all cases that he can point to, but in my view, nothing crucial. Trump did not impose immediate sanctions on Mexico and also promised to block purchases of weapons from the United States. Panama agreed to audit the concession with the Chinese company on the canal and look for U.S. investors. But it seems like they will retain control of the canal. Colombia is a separate case. I'll let Camila address that. That Latin America has become something of a whipping boy in the early days of the Trump administration should not be confused with the region now being a priority, which some analysts have suggested. Secretary Marco Rubio, the first Latino Secretary of State and the first to make his initial trip to the region in that job to Latin America in 100 years, has pledged to give Latin America the importance it deserves. But in his current visit to Central America this week, the agenda is basically negative: stopping migration, stopping drugs, and stopping spreading Chinese influence. And making it clear in his statements that the region will no longer be allowed to take advantage of the United States. There's no mention of carrots, trade, investment, no mention of democracy and the rule of law. Not only anti-Nicaragua or anti-Cuba, but nothing positive about democratic governments in Costa Rica or Panama, for example. Not a word. In his Wall Street Journal column, Rubio said governments that cooperated with the United States would be rewarded. My question is how? Maybe inoculation from any punitive measures is the best that Trump allies in the region can hope for, like Bukele and Milei. By now, there's little question that Trump is calling the shots on the administration's Latin America policy, and in fact, on everything else. It is probably wise not to pay too much attention to Rubio's record before becoming Secretary of State. On many issues, in rhetoric and approach, there is a chasm between Secretary Rubio and Senator Rubio. Most striking example of that chasm is the administration's evolving Venezuela policy. Rubio has always been virulent in his attacks against Maduro since he became president in 2014. Although Rubio has been an advocate of a very hardline policy against the authoritarian regime, the administration he serves has been moving towards a more accommodationist stance, as a sign that migration takes precedence over all else, and that the hardliners in this administration have the upper hand. The Trump administration has ended protection for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans in the United States and is negotiating a deal for Maduro to take back deportees, including the Tren de Aragua criminal organization. Trump has recognized Maduro as de facto president of Venezuela at a modest cost of 6 U.S. prisoners. Many Venezuelans feel a sense of betrayal. Trump's Venezuela policy in his first term, as I always said, was an electoral strategy aimed at winning Florida. That consideration is no longer relevant. I don't believe he ever saw fighting for democracy as a U.S. interest. So the world is turned upside down, tough on our allies and soft with our friends. Trump's recent declaration we heard yesterday about taking over Gaza should put to rest what some analysts have argued is the return of the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine does have some adherents in the administration, like the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who's referred to Monroe Doctrine 2.0. But the decider, President Trump, is not among the adherents. He's a real estate magnate who will try to make money and seek power wherever he can, whether in the Western Hemisphere or elsewhere. Latin America policy will be set by Trump's impulses, which can turn on a dime, as we've seen. And the team he directs will fall in line. One critical issue Alejandro mentioned that will test Latin America will be China's considerable presence and influence in the region. China is a key economic partner for virtually every country, and it is reasonable to expect pressures, as we saw in the case of Panama, to stem and diminish the role of China and to favor the United States. It will be a tough challenge for a region in dire economic straits, where there is no trade agenda in Washington, and there are incentives for U.S. companies to invest in the U.S., but not in Latin America. How will the region deal with these pressures? Many suggest, and I've read a couple of articles, thank you. I've read a couple of articles along these lines that this will lead to the United States becoming closer to China in the end, that China will be the beneficiary of these hardline policies. My view is that it's more complex than that. The responses will be varied depending on the size and importance of the country, its proximity to the United States, and the nature of Chinese trade and investments. Panama will react very differently than, say, Brazil. Countries like Peru, where the Chinese-run Chancay port has generated a lot of concern, fall somewhere in between Panama and Brazil. Peru has long benefited from Chinese trade and investment, but it will not want to alienate the United States. The responses will also depend on the nature of the threat and whether Trump actually follows through on his threats. If the U.S. imposes steep tariffs, that could have huge economic implications in Latin America and impel a turn to China. Other points of leverage, as we saw in the case of Colombia, include issuing visas, ending or changing free trade agreements. The United States has more free trade agreements in this hemisphere than any other part of the world. And these agreements so to either end them or make them more advantageous to the U.S. Of course, the U.S. recourse to any military action is the most sensitive of all and could build anti-U.S. sentiment, a turn to Beijing, and even generate some unity in a highly fragmented region, which of course we haven't seen so far in the early days. The final comment is this: it's useful to recall that the last surge of anti-Americanism in Latin America, which we saw during the Cold War, had nothing to do with U.S. policy towards the region. It was the opposition to the Iraq War under George W. Bush. Though admittedly not likely, it's possible to imagine that if Trump follows through on what appears to be his intentions in Gaza and the Middle East, that would also have repercussions in the hemisphere and could create significant strains. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now we turn to Camila to help us make sense of what happened between Petro and Trump, to help us think a little bit more seriously about how do you think the relationship between Colombia and the US will evolve during the Trump administration, and also, I mean, listen to your thoughts on US policy vis-a-vis Central America, Panama, etc. So again, thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alejandro, for the invitation and for allowing me to share my views from Colombia. Michael, it was a great introduction of what we're going to talk about. So, regarding Colombia, as many of you saw in the news last week, a diplomatic crisis unfolded between Colombia and the United States. President Gustavo Petro of Colombia refused to open the country's border to allow a U.S. military plane carrying deported Colombians to land in Bogota, the capital. The president's decision was driven by humanitarian concerns, particularly highlighting the inhumane treatment of Latin American migrants, which many consider are degrading. And President Petro, it's a political figure whose leadership warrants a separate analysis. Maybe we can do that later or in another opportunity. But he has expressed ambitions to emerge as an international leader or as a Latin American leader. And his actions were meant to send a strong message, but he did not fully account for the international repercussions and the impact on his own nationals. So this is regardless of whether his positions were or was commendable or not. So in response on Petro's action, the US government took, as Michael said, an aggressive approach, signaling to Latin America the extent of its power in this new geopolitical era. The retaliation included raising tariffs, revoking diplomatic visas, closing consulates, and sanctions to the financial system. As you might know, this is horrible for any nation, and these measures typically are reserved for countries like rogue nations, not Colombia. So, for example, as Michael also was saying, despite the ongoing sanctions against Venezuela compared to Colombia, the US has treated them more diplomatically, even sending a personal emissary from President Trump to address the migrant crisis with the Maduro regime. But they didn't discuss anything about democratic election. That it has been a concern in the region, what is going on in Venezuela, but they didn't discuss that. So this response shows that the US Latin American relations will increasingly focus on power dynamics, where countries more must comply with the US interests or face consequences. But it also shows that the US international policy will focus by domestic agenda and not to defend democratic values in the international space. The different treatment between the two nations, Colombia and Venezuela, was an example of this, as we saw. So the Colombian experience served as a stark example of this new reality that we are living in right now. Almost, and Michael mentioned it also already, the same thing is happening with the Panama Canal. The Panamanian government insists that the US claims about the canal's neutrality and Chinese involvement are not true, but the US government insists it is. So that's why even some ex-presidents, some Panamanian ex-presidents are afraid that this might involve a possibility of a military intervention or an economic sanctions that the US might apply if they don't do what the US government wants. But the Panamanian government doesn't even understand what is exactly what the US government wants. So this is a clear sign of how extreme is the US pressure right now to Latin American countries. So what we will see is the Trump administration positioning Latin American countries to choose, and this is the case of Panama, between economic ties with China or the US. And this is the scenario that we will face, and Michael already mentioned a little bit of that. So this shift suggests that relations with the US will be increasingly defined by a power struggle where the strong take advantage of the weak. Something that, let's be real, it has always been like that. And we know that in Latin America. But now, in the Trump era, masks are off. And that's what we are seeing. So right now, where masks are off, there are no international rules to protect us because, as we have seen, the new US government doesn't believe in them anymore. So Colombia and Panama are early examples of how difficult it can be for the global South to navigate this Trumpian new world order. So, in my view, not everyone shares this view. This approach will backfire in the future, generating a strong anti-US sentiment in Latin America, reminiscent of 1970s when socialist movements gained momentum in the region. And whether the current US administration is concerned about it or not, it is clear that the growing dissatisfaction with US policies will lead Latin America to diversify its international relations, no longer only relying on the US for support. We saw US flags being burned in Panama, for example, when Marco Rubio was there visiting the Panama Canal. And this is a sentiment that I think is going to be growing and growing. For sure, there are politicians embracing Trump manners in Latin America, like Bukele in El Salvador, like Noboa in Ecuador. But the way this new US government is treating Latinos will generate an anti US sentiment in the region. And this is something that will backfire in the future. And as I just said, not everyone shares this view, but I believe this is the direction in which the Latin American relations between US and Latam are heading. So that would be like my first remark, so I can let Mary Beth to like talk about Mexico, that I think it's a completely different story because the US treated Mexico completely different as how they treat us, the Colombians, because of course Mexico is the biggest economy, and the repercussions for the US with a strong Mexican answer will be more dangerous than a response from Colombia. So, Mary Beth, I will let you or allow you to go.
Thank
you.
Yeah, Mary Beth, please, the floor.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. So as pretty much everyone probably knows, Trump had threatened to impose 25% tariffs on both Mexico and Canada February 1st, arguing that they were not doing enough to stop the flow of fentanyl and migrants. Now, Mexico went into this crisis, or really into the second Trump presidency, with what I thought was a fair degree of confidence. They felt like they had struck a deal the first time Trump was president. They'd managed to get along despite the fact that Mexico had a left-leaning president. Obviously, Trump was a Republican. And so I think they thought they could cut a deal. And however, I think there were three things that made this much more complicated than the Mexicans initially expected. One is that unlike in the first Trump term, when the focus was very much on migration, really almost a monofocus, this time there's a whole range of issues, which include obviously drugs, but even on the trade front, there's the issue now, not just of there's an issue of deficits. Trump now has advisors who seem to me, anyway, to view tariffs as a way to collect revenue, not just a tool to punish or pressure other countries on themes like migration. So, we are seeing here the demands were kind of all over the place because they did include let's shrink the deficit, which would have been quite a thing to take on. So that was one issue. The second thing, Trump started with very high tariffs. The first time around, it was 5% he was threatening back in 2019, and they would have increased if Mexico didn't respond. This time, he out of the gates 25%, and they did not immediately sit down and negotiate, which happened in 2019. One of the reasons is the Mexicans this time did not really have interlocutors. Back in the first Trump term, they quickly developed a relationship that largely went through Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and Luis Videgaray, the Mexican foreign minister. They were able to hammer out a lot of agreements. And this time around, the Mexicans were a little flummoxed, I think, because a lot of the Trump appointees for the Secretary of Commerce and the trade representative and so on, they had not been confirmed yet. So they actually couldn't sit down and negotiate. And anyway, as you all probably know, a deal was reached pretty much at the last minute. Claudia Sheinbaum on the phone with Trump, and she agreed to send 10,000 troops to the border to particularly crack down on fentanyl, but also apparently deal with migration. And Justin Trudeau in Canada reached a somewhat similar deal later in the day. So in some ways you could say, well, it looks like we got somewhat of the same outcome we got back in 2019, and a lot of people will say, nothing new here. I do think there's a little more volatility, though, going forward, despite the fact that they did reach this agreement. As I mentioned, there's just more issues on the table. I think that we're going to have next year a scheduled review of the USMCA, the free trade agreement, and I think that's going to be a lot more contentious than what people had initially expected, that it'll be more than a review and a renegotiation. I do think the themes like the trade deficit and the idea of tariffs as a revenue collector for the U.S., that has not yet gone away. So those may well persist. I think on the drug issue, not only is it a bigger issue this time around, partly because, or perhaps largely because of fentanyl being such a larger problem than it was back in 2019, but my sense is in the Republican Party, there's been a growing consensus or a framing of the fentanyl problem as one of terrorism rather than the traditional drug trafficking problem. And because of that framing, there's this idea that, well, perhaps we should treat the drug traffickers like we treated ISIS. And, U.S. airstrikes and so on did inflict a lot of damage on ISIS. I think there's not a very well thought out understanding in the Trump administration of exactly how drug groups operate in Mexico. They don't operate, despite being very violent and using some terrorist violent tactics. They are not isolated groups with a political aim. They are deeply embedded in society. So the idea of military strikes is not only really unlikely to solve the problem, but it would infuriate Mexicans. Mexicans are very nationalistic, and of course, recall the days of U.S. invasions. That is very much, taught in schools. Every school child knows about that. Another reason for the volatility is I think Trump does not have the same type of veteran security and foreign policy policymakers around him that he had the first time who could weigh in and explain why it might be in the interest of the U.S. to have a good relationship with Mexico or not resort to unilateral military moves, et cetera. Having said all that, and I'll wrap up with this, there also may be some signs that things are not as crazy as they sometimes seem. The example I'll use is the same weekend when there was the big blow up with Colombia over the issue of sending U.S. military planes with deportees, and Petro obviously, kind of banged on the table and said, no way. There was an incident that was largely hushed up by both the U.S. and Mexican sides in which the U.S. wanted to send a military plane with deportees. Now, in Mexico, that is you don't just send military planes. They have huge codified regulations about when a U.S. military vehicle or aircraft can enter Mexican airspace, and it involves up to the, approval from the president. Okay, so it's not something that just Mexico for years has accepted charter planes from DHS carrying deportees. This is routine, happens all the time. No problem on the Mexican side with taking their deportees back in. But somebody came up with the idea in the U.S., perhaps not understanding the sensitivity, that they should also use a military plane, and the Mexicans said no. And I don't know, as I said, it's really been hushed up by both the U.S. and Mexican sides. I don't know exactly whether it was a lower level individual in Mexico who said simply no, that doesn't, that's against our rules, and all of a sudden sort of the people above him or her realized this was going to be a problem. But I think both sides very quickly started negotiating, and both sides played it down, including the White House. The military jet did not come. However, Mexico did accept several chartered, civilian aircraft, and has continued to basically, without complaints, accept back its citizens and take in citizens from other countries. So with that incident, even though we don't know a lot about the details, what it made me think is that there are very deep, longstanding relationships between the two sides. There are militaries, there are intelligence agencies. These are people who understand the consequences of there being a big conflict between the two neighbors. And I think it was a case in which these sort of traditional relationships helped solve the problem.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. Let me close this initial round of comments, maybe with some thoughts on the economies of Latin America and how the change in U.S. policies might affect the region. I think, first of all, we have to think a little bit on how changes in U.S. domestic economic policies will affect the U.S. economy and the world economy. And through that, how Latin America is going to be affected. And I think people there has looked at, let's say, the negative side of the balance sheet, the liability side, kind of saying, look, we have tariffs and protectionism, we have deportations, and we have uncertainty. All of these should be negative for growth and should be negative for inflation in the short run. I mean, people have run their models for the U.S. economy. They have simulated the imposition of 10% tariffs for imports from around the world and 25% tariffs for China. And that will give you something like, for 2026, a cumulative additional inflation, let's say, of 0.8%, a little bit less than 1 percentage point. But given, I mean, that the Fed is struggling on this last leg of this inflation, moving inflation from 2.5, 2.7 to 2, that obviously might significantly change the stance of monetary policy going forward. On growth, I mean, tariffs might also affect the level of GDP in 2027 by 0.5 percentage point. So growth will be below what it would have been by 0.25% in 2025 and 2026. When we move to deportations, I mean, people that have simulated the deportation of 8 million people throughout the current Trump administration really come out with much larger negative numbers. So if you think of the U.S. economy in the last 2 years, and you think of the U.S. growing at 2.5% per year, with inflation coming down, a lot of that had to do, according to many analysts, with the significant elasticity of labor supply coming from migrants. And if you put that process in reverse, then you might get, according to these models, that maybe growth will be, or the GDP level by the end of the Trump administration would be like between 6 and 7% below what it would have been in the absence of deportation. So basically, if you think that the U.S. would be growing at 2.5% for the next 4 years, that gives you a cumulative rate of growth of 10. If we have to subtract 7 percentage points of that, the U.S. might not grow during the next 4 years if the Trump administration deports all these people. On inflation, also, you have a much larger effect on inflation than with the tariffs. So people tend to say, look, on deportations, we will have a lot of noise, a lot of visible actions, but we will have a significantly smaller program than the one that was announced during the campaign. And also, I mean, a lot of people had gotten into the nitty-gritty of the logistical aspects of deportations, and they say, look, I mean, it's impossible to get all these planes, to mobilize all these people, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the positive side, on how the U.S. economy might end up doing, you have, I mean, people have thought that the Trump administration will imply the continuation of high deficits or slightly higher deficits, especially because the Trump tax cuts are going to be maintained and maybe additional tax cuts are going to be implemented. And deregulation, and obviously deregulation both in tech and energy, et cetera, will generate positive supply shocks. Overall, analysts ended up, for now, kind of saying, look, the macro scenario for the U.S. is kind of similar to what we were expecting on the growth side, 2.5% growth for 2025, and maybe slightly higher inflationary pressures, making the Fed, as we saw in the last meeting, hold on their interest rate cuts, and maybe people are starting to think that sometime in the second quarter, third quarter of this year, we might end up having some increases in interest rates going forward. This is good for the countries that have tight trade relations with the U.S., like Mexico, Central America, et cetera, because the U.S. economy will be doing well. It's going to be negative for the countries that do not have such an intense trade relationship, but have high debt that they need to refinance at higher rates. And also, obviously, this combination of policies will imply that the US dollar will remain strong, and a strong dollar is not good for commodity exporters, and obviously it's not good for people that has a lot of debt denominated in dollars. So in general, I mean, there will be important negative aspects for the region. Then, I mean, everything that has been highlighted by Michael, Camila, and Mary Beth presents a lot of contradictions in the objectives of Trump's policies towards the region. I mean, if you really want the region to align with the U.S. in closing down its borders to Chinese trade and investment, it is very hard to think that the region will do it if the U.S. is closing down its doors to products coming from Latin America. So in that sense, it will be important to start understanding what are the main priorities of the administration. I still think that deepening the fragmentation of the world economy and the separation between the U.S. economy and China will be the main guiding goal. And in that sense, protectionism against Latin American countries will be much less than the threats that we have seen now. I think I mean, Mary Beth had a very good point that, I mean, everything is thrown into the argument behind the tariffs. But if we count the number of times that Trump has justified tariffs, especially vis-a-vis Mexico, on the grounds of migration, fentanyl, versus bilateral trade deficits, I think the migration and security or drug issues rank much, much higher. And hopefully, in that sense, it is a negotiation tool. I think on migration, I mean, the Mexican government, as Mary Beth was saying, I mean, there's 250,000 Mexicans being deported every year. On migration, the Mexican government has been willing to accommodate all of the demands of U.S. governments in the last 8 years. And it has not been politically costly for the Mexican government as of now to accommodate this. So I would tend to think that on migration, we will see accommodation by the Mexican government. On organized crime, that's maybe one of the few areas in which the Sheinbaum government has significantly deviated and differentiated itself from López Obrador government since the beginning, meaning that the Sheinbaum government has structured a policy to limit, to attack, and to bring down organized crime, and that will align relatively well with the U.S. However, I'm pretty sure the U.S. wants not only Mexican policy changes, but also cooperation with U.S. Organizations to strengthen, and maybe U.S. security entities operating in Mexico hand in hand with Mexican security bodies, and that will be much harder to accept for Claudia Sheinbaum. And third, I think it will be very important for Mexico from the U.S. side to significantly limit its trade relationship with China. I think there has been an exaggeration on the extent in which China is being used as a backdoor. Mexico is being used as a backdoor for Chinese exports to come to the U.S., but it's an important possibility, and the U.S. wants to close that door. And I think in that sense, Mexican trade policy will have to align 100% with U.S. trade policy vis-a-vis China. And I think on investment, Mexican FDI policy of authorizing foreign direct investment coming from China will have to go through a coordination process with U.S. authority, focus on security issues. I think Camila, in her list of leaders of Latin America that were waiting for Trump, forgot Milei. So obviously we have Ecuador, El Salvador, and Argentina, three countries that have very clearly aligned with the Trump administration, all of them with programs with the IMF and expecting significant support in terms of their and lack of access to the international capital market. So they're expecting significant U.S. support for their financing possibilities going forward. And then going forward, it will be very interesting to see what's the position that the Trump administration take on elections in Latin America. Some of them were mentioned now, but I mean, we have, elections in Bolivia, elections in Ecuador, in Chile, and then Honduras, Costa Rica, Peru, and then we'll have elections in Colombia and Brazil in 2026. And that, I think, will be very interesting to see exactly how the U.S. plays those things. So for the next, let's say, quick round of questions, I would, I will ask Mary Beth to take a little bit some risk in helping us think what are the possible scenarios and what does she think might end up being the outcome of these negotiations between Mexico and the U.S. all the way through the stages that she mentioned. In April, we will have the reviews of the free trade agreements that the executive action from the White House asked for. And then we will have a process of review, renegotiation of the USMCA that supposedly has to conclude in 2026, but it might conclude before. For Camila, I think it was, my very immediate question will be, it's hard to think that the U.S. administration planned the episode vis-a-vis Colombia, and to what extent, really Petro played into the U.S., into Trump's hands, and actually gave the U.S. administration a very simple episode to show how tough that could be. But more than that, my question would be how Colombian society analyzed the whole episode. There's a lot of opposition to Petro but within this episode, how has it been perceived, and what is the opinion, and how it's affecting domestic politics, the very visible confrontation between President Petro and President Trump. And to Michael, I think something that sometimes we miss in this discussion, and I think it's very important, is how does he see the relationship between Brazil and the U.S. moving forward in the next couple of years under Lula, no? So with that, maybe I'll turn the floor to you, Mary Beth, then to Camila, and then to Michael.
Thank you. So just to go through it quickly, the scenarios, I think that the USMCA negotiations will be tougher. I do think that likely Mexico will have to give some ground. My sense is that the U.S., I think Trump realized in the threat that almost became reality of these tariffs, he got a lot of blowback from all kinds of manufacturing associations, the auto industry in a big way, et cetera, who all emphasized to him that this would lead to higher prices in the United States and real pain for U.S. industries. So I think there may have been some kind of reality check there. Having said that, he's going to push for more from in terms of probably U.S. content, I would imagine, of products. So I imagine there's going to be some shift there. On migration, I agree with you. I think Mexico has been a very, very cooperative, and the numbers have gone down dramatically in the last year, the numbers of arrests on the U.S.-Mexico border. So I think Mexico will continue to cooperate. They've given every sign they're willing to do that. And then the third one, drugs, I think that one is the real question mark to me, because I think there's questions on both sides. I think Sheinbaum could use this as a opportunity to strengthen a policy that is tougher on organized crime, taking advantage of using that U.S. pressure, converting it into sort of a political imperative for her. And in theory, she could reestablish and augment cooperation, which has kind of slid over the last couple of years. But I think there's real questions on both sides. I think on the U.S. side, does Trump actually have a policy that is looking at the very complex problem that exists in Mexico, in which crime groups have been taking over territory effectively and becoming ever more important in the legal and illegal economies. So this has become, really woven into the fabric of large parts of the Mexican nation. It's really complicated. So does Trump want a couple of trophies, some kingpins who he can, show off that they were arrested and sent to the U.S., and some headlines and something that looks kind of sexy? Or does he actually want to do something that can address and limit or pull back the penetration? And then on the Sheinbaum side, I think the big question is, she doesn't have the resources all by herself to really take on a monster. Is she willing to cooperate significantly more with the U.S. when there's been a real sort of concern for sovereignty on the part of her party? But the second thing, and this is really crucial, her own party, like many other parties in Mexico, the base of those parties, mayors, governors, all kinds of signs that they're very involved with drug trafficking and other crime groups. Is she willing to actually take steps to cut that corruption? Because it could be a bit destabilizing and difficult for her politically.
To you, Camila, and I mean, if you want to expand on your thoughts on the U.S.-Venezuela relationship that you started in your initial remarks, it would be great as well. Thanks.
Okay, so then I will answer your question about Venezuela. I think I talked to Michael Shifter once. I interviewed him before the Trump election. And we here in Colombia, or I said it many times, that I think Trump's government is going to treat Maduro as he did kind of with North Korea. Nothing is going to happen with the Maduro regime. They're going to have like kind of a negotiation between them. Maduro is going to receive some migrants. Trump is going to send them to Venezuela, but the U.S. is not going to say anything about democratic elections in that country. That's why Trump sent a personal emissary. He didn't send Marco Rubio to Venezuela, because he knows what Marco Rubio thinks about Venezuela, and when he was in Congress, how he supported the opposition. So as we all know, Trump is a very pragmatic leader. He is a businessman. So he doesn't care if in Venezuela they have a democracy or not. He just wants Maduro to collaborate with them to receive the Venezuelan migrants that they want to send. So I think that's what's going to happen in Venezuela, in my view. But maybe that's a bet. We don't know if that's going to happen or not, but that's what I think it's how it's going to evolve. And that is going to be very difficult for the region, especially in Colombia, because as you said, we have a very polarized country right now. The opposition to Petro's government, which is the right, supports the opposition in Venezuela. And they have been criticizing Petro a lot because Petro has not condemned openly what has happened in Venezuela. And what the government is saying, we cannot condemn this openly because we have to have relationship with them, because they are our neighbors. We have guerrillas operating in Venezuela. We cannot cut relationships with them because we already cut them in the past, and it was a huge mistake. So now that Trump comes into power, and Trump doesn't say anything to Maduro and what he did with the elections, stealing the elections. So this is a huge message to the region that really the US is not concerned about protecting democracy. And they say right now, this is not what we want to be our role in LATAM, and I think in the rest of the world. So I think that's what's going to happen in Venezuela. And we're going to have a dictatorship in Venezuela as we have them in Cuba. And the US government doesn't going to care, because the interest of the Trump government is, I don't want to receive more Venezuelans here, and I want to send you the ones that we already have in the U.S. territory. So I think that's what's going to happen in Venezuela. Regarding Petro and what you said, that the U.S. didn't plan this retaliation, for sure the U.S. didn't plan it, and for sure Petro made a mistake, because he gave Trump and the US government every single argument to impose these tariffs that he imposed for a few days, or he said that he was going to impose, for canceling these visas and so on. But what is true is that Petro didn't allow this plane to land in Colombia because it was a military plane, and usually migrants come in commercial flights. Claudia Sheinbaum didn't receive a military plane either. And this was not the reaction that the US government had with Mexico. The US government had this reaction with Colombia because of the tweets that Petro wrote against President Trump. And that's why I was telling you that Petro wants to be a Latin American leader. And he wanted to say what is happening with the migrants, with the Latino people in the US, is unacceptable. And I think there's a lot of people that thinks that way, that what is happening, like how these people is coming here, and how the Trump administration are saying that they are criminals, which they are not. The people that came in that flight, they didn't have criminal records. So I think that was the complaint that the President Petro was stating on his tweet. Like, we cannot accept that they treat these people this way, because it's inhumane. So for sure, Petro didn't handle this thing how it should be handled, internationally speaking. The US and Trump said, because this guy is tweeting this against us, there goes their sanctions, and now we can give an example to the rest of the countries in Latin America and see, if you act like him, this is what will happen to you. So how people is receiving this here, for sure the opposition is criticizing Petro, because if the US will impose what they say they were going to impose, it will be a catastrophe for Colombia. So a lot of people is criticizing Petro here. But also, there's another side of this equation, that is the followers that Petro have, that feel that it was good for him to state that Trump shouldn't be treating the immigrants that way. And Petro is talking to his supporters, because we will have elections in 2026. He cannot be reelected, but he wants his project to be reelected. And he's using this confrontation with electoral purposes. That's why I was telling in my previous intervention that this is going to raise an anti-US sentiment. And there might be some political leaders that will use this, electorally speaking. So we are divided in Colombia, as I think every country is divided right now in the world, because polarization is like the world we're seeing in our democracies. But as Trump speaks to some of his supporters and he's sending them messages with the deportations, Petro here in Colombia is also sending a message to his followers when he says to Donald Trump, you cannot treat our people how you're treating them in your country.
Thanks. Michael?
Yeah, there are a few Brazilian experts who said, who told me that they thought that Trump's intention was not to have this confrontation with Colombia, but either Mexico or Brazil. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I've heard that in a few conferences I participated in. I mean, I think Brazil is a very different case than Colombia and Mexico. You don't have the migration issue; it's not as sensitive. I think there's no way that the United States is going to get Brazil to sort of disconnect from China. It's just too, it's just too huge and important. So I think there's going to be a lot of tension. We'll see whether the threats about applying tariffs to the BRICS, where that goes. That's been out there. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but it's out there. And certainly, again, going back to the international, since Lula sees himself as really a global player and has made a lot of comments about Ukraine and the Middle East and so forth. We'll see where that goes. But if the Middle East really, if Trump really sort of goes ahead and pursues what he kind of hinted at last night, that's gonna create a lot of tension with Lula, I think, more than any other leader in Latin America. And then we have the elections coming up in 2026, and I wouldn't at all be surprised if Trump and his people get involved trying to. It's not clear whether Lula is gonna run again. Bolsonaro can't run, but somebody from his movement might be a candidate. And as we know, there's a very strong connection there between Trump and Trump's family and the Bolsonaro family. And so anybody that's blessed by Bolsonaro, I could see, Trump getting involved, and that obviously would create a lot of tensions as well. So I mean, I don't think this is going to go off the rails. I don't think Lula's going to want to pick a fight with Trump. I don't think Celso Marin's going to want to pick a fight with Trump. But there's clearly going to be tension. But I think the tension will be manageable. That's kind of my sense. It's not going to kind of get completely out of hand. And some of the issues of China, I think they're not going to be able to do anything with Brazil. Migration issue is really it's not relevant in that relationship. And I don't think, the drug issue is relevant in every country, but I don't see the United States really pushing on the drug issue in Brazil. And so that I think it's going to be tense. It's hard to see that it's going to be like Milei or Bukele or Noboa, but I don't think I think it's going to be manageable.
So it's the BRICS, Lula's intention of being a world leader, and then the election in
2026. Yeah, I think so.
So I mean, we have time for a couple of questions. So if somebody has a question, raise your hand, and we'll pick two questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So there's one here. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Vadim Grishin. I'm faculty here. I missed one word, which is really important for national agenda of current administration and international agenda. This word is oil. Even when we discuss relations between US and Venezuela, Brazil as well, Mexico. So how oil production and the goal of the current administration decrease oil price can impact on relations between Latin American country and US. Thank you.
Thanks. If we have another question, we'll collect them, and then we Deseo this. Oh.
Hi. Alejandro, you were talking about models, and with all this volatility, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen over the next 4 years. This is a domestic policy that is driving an international policy with a major stick. So when you look at the models, maybe you're also thinking about what are the worst case scenarios that you can model and what kind of probability do you assign to them?
Hard question. I think the level of uncertainty is huge. Let us turn to oil and how oil issues play into the Latin America-US relationship. I don't know, Mary Beth, you want to address the Mexico issue, and maybe Michael and Camila, Venezuela.
Yeah, I don't actually see a huge problem, although it depends on whether there are more tariffs. I do think there's two very different visions right now because President Trump obviously very much oriented toward fossil fuels. Claudia Sheinbaum is a climate scientist with a PhD, certainly has plans and desires to do more in terms of green energy. Having said that, she's really constrained by a lack of money and arguably by some of the policies her own predecessor put in place. So I'm sure she'll disagree with Trump, and if there are international talks, she will not be on the side of the same side as him. Having said that, like I said, her mentor and predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, was a big fossil fuels guy. So she's sort of learned to get along with that. I think if there are tariffs, that is a significant problem. Mexico depends a lot on natural gas and gasoline coming from the U.S., but there's a fair amount of Mexican oil that also goes to the U.S. For refining. So that could really hit both sides pretty hard if there are tariffs.
Michael, and then Camila.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I actually had it in my notes, but I didn't say it. I don't think, maybe I did. But on the Venezuela issue, as Camila said, I think the accepting deportees was important, but I think oil is also extremely relevant in the case of Venezuela. And it's not. Trump had this quote saying, we don't need Venezuelan oil. If you remember, he said that a couple of weeks ago. But it's clear, first of all, if Venezuelan oil production goes up, more oil is on the market, prices will keep prices down. And secondly, he has a lot of good friends who see the possibilities of making a lot of money investing in the petroleum sector in Venezuela. And let's not forget, this is a very personalistic government. And one has to look at his friends and his associates also to see what's driving him. So I think that's also a big factor. And the calculation is, they take all these deportees, but then, the economy gets better because oil production goes up. And so you're going to have less out migration. Now, some people in the opposition say you're going to have a lot of migration will continue to go up because Maduro is still there. And other people say, well, if the economy gets better, there'll be less migration. So there's a little bit of debate of what migration is. But I think that's very much part of the calculation here is not so much that we need the oil from Venezuela, but first of all, it's part of the international market. And second of all, it offers opportunities for lots of people. And obviously Chevron, which has a special license to operate in Venezuela, it came up, it's been extended. That also sends a signal that it's supporting private oil companies. So, that just tells you where I think things are headed. It's not as important as the other, but I think it's definitely very relevant in the case of Venezuela.
Camila, I don't know.
I just
on the oil question.
Yes, I just have something to add because I think Michael answered everything regarding Venezuela. But oil has been important not only for the Trump administration. Remember that the Biden administration also relaxed the sanctions to allow Chevron to explore and exploit petroleum and gas in Venezuela. So this has been a policy that the U.S. government has had with Venezuela. So it's not only Trump, because it's just that Trump is, as I said before, that the masks are off. So the way they are communicating are different. But the relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela regarding the oil, and specifically Chevron in that country, has been the same in this government and in the past one.
Thank you very much. And coming back to the issue of the probability of a big crisis. Obviously nobody will put a number into that. But if you look at the world economy, that is significantly relying on the U.S. as Europe struggles economically, and China has slowed down significantly, it's very hard to envision, China really being the engine of the world economy again. You have, advanced economies having significantly ramped up debt. And then you have a lot of uncertainty on the trade front that might actually generate either a negative supply shock or significant uncertainty on the inflation side that will get the Fed to increase rates by much more than what the market expects. So I think the elements for a negative surprise on the world economy are there. We also know that, I mean, Trump has really been very cautious when he sees negative market reaction to pull back. And in that sense, what Mary Beth was saying that happened this weekend, also being influenced by the private sector, I mean, really stressing the impacts that this could have on inflation, etc., has been another force that helps to dial down some of these policies. But definitely a world of high debt, low growth, and a single engine world economy puts us in a more vulnerable and delicate situation. With that, let me close today's event. Let me thank Mary Beth, Camila, and Michael for a great discussion. And we can rejoin next Monday to discuss what happened next weekend. No, that will bring us more issues to talk about. But I mean, seriously, I mean, hopefully we can do this again in person. And also with Michael Stott, that had to fly to Mexico to write about the trade war that never happened. But he's already in Mexico, but we will have him back. And hopefully we will invite this panel again to see where we are in a few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.